Buenos dias. My name is Guadalupe, and I will be presenting a proposal for a plurilingual and critical approach to content and language integrated learning in Mexican higher education. This is an overview of my presentation. Mainly, I will be discussing how a first experience I had with content and language integrated learning in my home university in Mexico that was focused on English only has now emerged into a proposal for a plurilingual approach to CLIL. And I also talk about the contemporary policy in Mexico and the research that has informed my research design. Before I go into Mexican higher education, I frame my research in a broader concern in worldwide higher education. And it's basically the added nature of many programs that we have in higher ed and the lack of collaboration and synergy among actors that are working sometimes with common agendas, underlining agendas. I purposely put internalization at the top of this chart because it has been one of the main shaping forces in higher education. In this context of internalization, I started as a language teacher in Mexico. There was a big change in education in the framework of the North American Free Trade Agreement around the 90s. This really opened a neoliberal ideology across all education, but specifically in higher education. English became the new norm of development and competitiveness, both at individual and social levels. I had the opportunity to coordinate Departamento de Lenguas Extranjeras in a public university in Mexico. And in these years of experience, I had many concerns, but I think my main concern was that English, when we were supposedly called Centros de Lenguas Extranjeras, was the main language, and it was also taught mainly as a subject, completely separate to mainstream curriculum and the professional degrees of students. Drawing from this concern, I had the opportunity to lead an action research collaborative project in 2017 to really support collaboration between content and language teachers that would pair to strategically decide what languages, English language competences and skills were relevant for their courses. Because of the background of our students in this public university, they didn't have the language proficiency requirement that is usually required for an ME, English as a medium of instruction class. So the teachers really had to decide in what aspects they would integrate the language collaboratively and strategically. What did we learn from this experience? First, that, well, proficiency actually is not a limitation or it should be considered a gatekeeper for content-based approaches, because when their students, learners, and teachers, when they are given support, for example, by language departments, language teachers, and spaces for collaboration, they are able to develop autonomy, confidence in their learning, and this motivates future learning. And we also learned that content teachers were becoming more aware of the language component of their courses. And at a personal level, I learned that I was not an expert in this project. I was more a participant, collaborating, co-constructing, and embarking together in a new initiative. When I had the opportunity to study my graduate program in Canada, as part of my MA thesis, I critically unpacked some of the discourse and reactions that I received from this initiative when we invited new teachers or administrators to support the project. And one of the reactions, I'd like to highlight the second one, was that, well, first, as teachers, we have to learn English, and then we teach our students. Primero nos deben enseñar inglés y luego nosotros a los alumnos. This really evidences vertical relationships of power in classrooms when in our university we, in theory, had a learner-centered approach, and CLIL was actually an opportunity for co-learning and collaboration. I also came across a critical question in my MA research that I had to answer was, who is a CLIL teacher? And according to IRE, we are all CLIL teachers because language is deeply embedded in the learning of any discipline. I also came across comments that were racializing the variety of English that these students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were learning, but also perceptions and comments on their language, their first language, that was Spanish, was also considered deficient because it was not the formal academic way or variety of schooling. As I learned in my graduate program, I came across this vision, not pedagogy, but this educational vision of plurilingualism that actually supports, it has sound pedagogical frameworks to support students with unbalanced, emergent, and unique language competencies to learn across the curriculum, not only additional languages. And this is when I started to envision the possibility of a plurilingual approach to CLIL that integrated languages that are part of the ecology of Mexican higher education. And once again, the first features that were relevant for the first initiative that I had in my home university were also relevant to integrating more languages, such as the strategic nature, a really critical reflection of how these languages can be made relevant or what skills are really, they have a purpose in these courses. The action-oriented approach, it means that the tasks that we plan in which we integrate additional language competencies have to be real, authentic tasks. And when we work with different language proficiency levels, mediation is a core construct, as the same culture is deeply embedded with languages, specifically local and indigenous languages. Also, as I advance in my program, and now in my PhD program, I learned about critical theories that led me to another critical question in my research is, really, can we integrate local and international languages in classrooms without reinforcing power imbalances and hierarchies that already exist? And what I'm learning to try to tackle and to address these questions in my research is that, well, we, as all the actors involved, students and teachers, have to constantly be developing a concientización or a critical awareness of the power imbalances and the sources of these power imbalances between cultures and languages. We also have to center in the pedagogies and in plurilingualism, the values, beliefs, and practices of marginalized, like indigenous languages, and also the experiences of marginalized students and racialized bilinguals to start critical conversations. I'm also inspired to learn about researchers and scholars that are using plurilingualism as entry points to critical agendas such as decolonial thinking and anti-racism, both in Canada and in Mexico. As I learned also about the critical aspect of my research, another insight that I had is that a lot of the contemporary policy in Mexico that I'm framing my research in, and worldwide policy interested in diversity and interculturality, has happened in the last 30, 40 years, whereas countries with colonial history, such as Mexico, have had monocultural and monolingual ideologies for centuries. So it's important to learn about these histories and how these logics are still present in our classrooms. This is a brief summary, but in a nutshell, after Mexico's independence from Spain, there was a very strong mestizo ideology in which we were built on this idea of one culture, one nature. Sorry, one culture, one language. And not unfortunately, this homogeneous culture and ideology was met with a lot of resistance still at present time. And there was movements, a lot of activism from indigenous actors. And there were many ways in which they shaped multicultural policy in Mexico. But one of the results of these fights and activism was the emergence of 2001 of an intercultural bilingual indigenous system that is also now a system in higher education. And what is relevant from this history is that we have to learn how these logics are still present, but also we have to do research and integrate these actors and indigenous actors that work in these systems of critical intercultural education, because they are the main actors that have brought change and social justice agendas forward in our country. Colette Despagne notes that because of this specific history and development of Mexico, there have been two paradigms that are separate in our education, both at macro and at micro levels. As you can see, there are different values and ideologies, but what I find relevant for my research is there's also points of convergence. For example, there's a talk on the need for intercultural competences and development. But I'm framing my research from the critical approach to interculturality. And I'm also bringing forward the need to bring actors from both of these paradigms together to collaborate and to bring these agendas forward. The work of a Mexican scholar in general education has inspired my research design. He is Rincón Gallardo, and he works with a construct that is counter-hegemonic practices in education that are mainly pedagogical practices that disrupt traditional instructional cultures and power relations of schooling. So the scholars that inspire his work say, well, we have to learn and how social movements in history have really brought about change in our everyday interactions and institutions and policy. So how has this change happened? These social movements or cultural transformations start with critical communities. Critical communities are actors both willing and able to develop new ideas, values, and practices, and they actively disseminate their ideas. They have activism in their social networks, but they're also pushing and finding spaces in their in policy, in their institutions and their context. And these, it's like a snowball effect, is bringing change among these three arenas. That is also an entry point to bring transformation in education. As we know, plurilingualism is a counter-hegemonic practice. Because of time, I just share some bullet points on how it is bringing change to dominant hegemonic cultures in education. So this is what we have to highlight to keep that critical aspect of plurilingualism at the front. The contemporary policy that I'm anchoring my research and the need to bring actors from different educational systems is la nueva ley de educación, la Ley General de Educación Superior. It was published in 2021, and it brings as como acción sustantiva de educación superior, the need to bring intercultural approaches and perspectives into all systems of higher education, and also all systems of higher ed need to contribute to la revitalización de lenguas indígenas. And actually in the law, it is placed before lenguas extranjeras. So how does this research and policy inform my research design? This is the big picture. As a researcher, I have the goal of starting and supporting the development of a critical community in which I will invite actors in different educational systems, but I'm centering to start this critical community with the intercultural system that is, they are working with intercultural bilingual programs. But the main goal or another convergence among these three systems is that sustainability is a course required across all systems. So basically, my role is to bring this community of actors to envision and to co-construct what a plurilingual approach to sustainability courses would look like. I didn't talk about the macro policy and institutional policy and sustainability, but this is a framework that also is required for all universities. I will work with a comparative case study approach in which I will study the impact, the systemic change of this critical community of practice and a plurilingual approach to CLIL how it is impacting the instructional, the social, and the political arenas across these 3 sites. Why sustainability? This is a field in which there have been calls to integrate indigenous ways of knowing or local ways of knowing and knowledge. And there is a correlation between ecological diversity and linguistic and cultural diversity around the world. As an example, in Mexico, 46% of the natural areas are inhabited by indigenous communities. Why? Because their ways of knowing, their ways of being is deeply embedded in their conceptualizations and the cosmovision of knowledge, of land, how they conceptualize land and the ecology in which they live. And finally, I don't have time to explain the research methods, but in a nutshell, I have shifted my questions from the mere implementation of plurilingualism to now exploring how power relations among languages and actors are being changed or affected by a plurilingual approach to CLO. I'd like to finish with my conclusions, focusing on the second one that I find very relevant, that we have to connect plurilingualism to larger agendas of social justice and transformation. And the most important, to work with frameworks of research in which we can do research with and for communities of educators and students to bring more synergy and collaboration in higher education. Finally, my references, and muchas gracias.